This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. This is Dennis Schrantz. Thank you for joining us. We are rapidly approaching D-Day with the submission of the RFPs expected on the 23rd, which means we should have some pretty workable drafts by the 20th, 21st, certainly by the 22nd. We recognize here at LA-PRISTA that you've been giving an awful lot of information through these webinars that we've been sponsoring. And today is our attempt to kind of bring some of these things together and recap and see what types of questions you have as you're getting closer and closer to, by now, probably some of you finishing touches on your grant proposal and some of you getting serious about the writing. So thank you for joining us. I want to particularly thank our funders who helped us with all of this work and making note of the Huey and Angelina Wilson Foundation, who've been so supportive of not only the system change work that we're doing here at LA-PRISTA and in the Center for Justice for Innovation, but also for the programs in this region, the state here. We're sitting in Baton Rouge today. We're hosted by O'Brien House. You got a few people here today who are listening in, and then we're going to have a planning session with them afterwards. I want to thank the United Way of Southeast Louisiana and our friends in Northwestern United Way as well, and others that have funded us, the Kabakoff Family Foundation, Baptist Community Ministries, Greater New Orleans Foundation, and others. And to remind everyone that LA-PRISTA's mission is to promote high fidelity of implementation through these types of convenings, training, and TA. And having done this work in a dozen other states, I can tell you that this is the hard part. Most states do a pretty good job on planning, but they falter at implementation. And so we're right at one of the most important facets of this work. If you've joined us for any of these presentations that we've done before, you'll recognize that some of the beginning slides are a bit redundant, because every time we do a presentation like this, we're joined by people that haven't attended any before, and so we have to do a little bit of business. And this slide here reminds us that the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative, the LA-PRI, has got 4 different phases, and each phase has 4 steps. And you can look at this in terms of your own parish where you work and see where you're at in the process. It's pretty safe to say that all 5 parishes and then another 5 in the second tier of parishes have gotten through phase 2. And as we look at phase 3, we know that only a couple of parishes have got a community coordinator in place, and those places are blessed to have some extra help here as you do this work. Some parishes have completed their community assessment, some haven't. To the extent that those parishes have, then this work that we're doing in this application is made easier. And what makes some of this work difficult right now, and why these seminars are important, we think, but also kind of difficult, is because not all of you have had the in-depth training that some of you have had on such things as the Department of Corrections overarching policy, the case logic model, case collaborative supervision and management model, etc. And so we've been trying to get that information to you both in written form and then through these seminars touching on them as well. And what we're approaching here is phase 4 and the implementation of the framework with fidelity and then delivering the work. So that's where we sit. Another piece of information that many of you already know is that the 7 core criteria for funding these projects, as described by the Department of Corrections, puts us in a pretty good spot as we're doing this comprehensive work. Specific measurable changes, they're in alignment with the LA-PRI local implementation goals in the local LA-PRI steering teams. And for those of you that have been organized under that rubric and have been doing this training, you're in good shape to be able to explain to the department through this RFP exactly how that's been working. And to the degree that you stick to the model and you describe the various elements of the model that you've learned about both up till today and through today, you're very likely to score higher. You'll note that seeking to address the needs of moderate and high-risk prisoners, this was clarified recently in the RFP addendum, and it was indicated earlier in the RFP that if you were low risk and had high needs, that you were eligible. And that question was raised by me, in fact, and the department and DMB said, you're right, they got to be moderate to high risk. No low risk are targeted. That is not a priority population. And if you stick to that population, then you will score higher. Obviously, your business you've been about for such a long time now, many of you, is to identify your assets, your resources in the community, your barriers to getting those assets and resources lined up to the people who are moderate to high risk, and then determining what the gaps are in services. And this is the first opportunity we've had to try to fill those gaps with funding. And we obviously know that this RFP is not going to give us all the funding we need. It's a very limited amount of money, and it's eligible to an awful lot of people besides just those of us who are working on reentry. So we have to set our sights on using this as the first bit of money we get and use the comprehensive planning process beyond the RFP to work together as much as we can to raise other dollars to be able to fill in those gaps. We'll give everyone a chance to get through this RFP process, and then LA-PRISTA will come back to you and begin working with you, particularly the Tier 2 parishes who are not eligible for this funding, to continue to work on your comprehensive plan and look for other funding sources and help you with achieving extra funding. And so we're looking for blended funding streams both now and in the future. And of course, as you would expect, has to be replicated, and when it's replicated to produce similar results, and very critically, as you all know, as the LA-PRI is, based on evidence-based practices and best practices, and offering clear results. We're going to talk a lot about that as we have before, because the RFP is silent on what the performance expectations are. And we're clear on our end the types of things that we've been recommending to the department and to the parishes. And we strongly urge you to be consistent across the board with this. That will strengthen everyone's hand. But obviously, as you look at those types of 7 core criteria, you know that as you're doing this comprehensive planning, you'll be in better shape to score well. And that's what we've been doing for these past 7 weeks. We've given you a cross system review of what's in the RFP and what's in the Comprehensive Community Reentry Plan, the CCRP. And as LA-PRISTA has traveled the state this past week, we visited most of the places in the state that are doing the work, both Tier 1 and Tier 2. And there seems to be a pretty uniform approach that folks are completing whole sections of the Comprehensive Community Reentry Plan and then using that information to cut and paste into the RFP, because unlike the RFP, the CCRP, the Comprehensive Community Reentry Plan, is very explicit about the information that it suggests that you provide, and in some cases provides that information for you, whereas the RFP simply says, tell us. And so there's been a good recognition of how the CCRP is helpful. So now we're going to be repeating and recapping what we've seen in each of these presentations we've done, starting for just a couple of minutes about the importance of an intermediary organization. You see the definition on your screen. It is put into place to help fulfill strategic goals. From the jurisdictions we've talked to that are actively participating in the RFP, they have either selected their intermediary organization or are about to this week. And it's been a very dynamic, robust process. It's been very positive, and we'll be welcoming a lot of intermediary organizations to the table, some who have been involved and some who haven't been involved. And they're understanding that their role is to help provide services and training, technical assistance, and to help fulfill the strategic goals of our funding sources, which means, among other things, the ability to leverage other dollars. And a good intermediary organization will be seeking other dollars immediately. We know one intermediary who is planning on taking the RFP that's submitted and reformatting it for another submission within a couple of days. That's a good example of what an intermediary does, and for the most part, intermediaries are not seeking to provide services, although in some cases they do. And they always, let's say usually, but almost always, re-grant funds as allowed in this RFP to subcontractors. There's good research on intermediary organizations, and they have helped the grassroots organizations achieve a better degree of fidelity to some of these complex approaches that we recommend through these evidence-based practices. There's been a lot of press and frankly some criticism of the RFP process because it is so challenging with 49 pages of descriptions and all sorts of requirements that you have to jump through. And many of the smaller grassroots organizations who are doing some excellent work and who in many respects are so vital to what we're doing have felt that it'd be very difficult for them to participate because the expectations are so onerous. And what we're seeing is the work of intermediary organizations to bring those service providers together, send in one application, and then subaward funding to them so that they do not have to do the heavy lifting of performance measurement and reporting, et cetera. That's done by the intermediary. Our recommendation is pick one. And we sent out information. It's in the comprehensive reentry plan. Documents you can go to understand this. We've given you scoring sheets on how to select. And for the most part, that's done. But if you were here listening from a tier 2 parish, as I traveled to Lafayette and to Calcasieu and up in Ouachita, there's still that work is happening. And so this is intended for them as well. And I promise some assistance to them. And I just wanted to recap that here. I'm going to move next into looking at some of the priority services. But before I do, let me open the phones. I think you're all on mute, which is very good because we can't hear any background noise. And our participants in the room have been uncharacteristically silent the past 15 minutes. So let me open it up and see if there's any questions or comments about an intermediary organization. I'll give you a moment to unmute. All right, hearing none. Now we move into the second presentation that we had, and it's about defining assets, barriers, and gaps, and understanding in the comprehensive community reentry plan. There's very good documentation in there about what's expected through the LA-PRI community assessment that you've already completed or continue to work on. And we have recommended in the comprehensive community reentry plan, and many of you are subscribing to this, is that we're looking at the original 4 priorities of the LA-PRI: housing, employment, education, behavioral health, with many of the parishes have formed up committees to do an analysis of the assets, the barriers, and the gaps. And about 2 months ago, we expanded that view to include, at the recommendation of some of the parishes, 2 other important issues around family reunification and legal issues. And now in the comprehensive community reentry plan, we recommend all 6 of these, which is actually 7, since behavioral health is both mental health and substance abuse. And what we're learning and what we're hearing is that there are formed up committees that are either already existing or are coming together for these purposes to look at assets, barriers, and gaps, use the information in the comprehensive community reentry plan and the community assessment to gather that information. And once it's gathered and you have an idea of your assets, your barriers, and your gaps, you then can cut and paste that and put that directly into your application. I've seen a couple of examples of that. LA-PRISTA has offered to look at draft documents. We've seen a couple and they look pretty strong. There is a difficulty, though, in nailing down the numbers. You really need to know numbers. If you've got a good asset that's got a lot of slots, how many slots is there? We're starting to hear some positive feedback around the notion that perhaps we target for the dollars that we're seeking. If it's a $500,000 application, which is the top limit that we've recommended, that we seek to serve perhaps 150 people. I'll talk about this in a minute, but we look at cohorts of 20, 30, 40, 50 people at a time, and after each cohort, we take a pause and examine what's worked and not worked, and then we do a better job with the next cohort. But that is working with these cohorts around these issues. When you are in good contact and communication with your service providers, you will learn that many of them are already doing this work for this very population, and they will voice their support to be able to provide those services for these people without additional resources. Seeing examples of that. And if folks want to please mute your microphones during this, because everybody can hear your shuffling of papers, clearing of throats, and whatever you may say on the side about how I'm doing this. And we've seen the service providers step up to the plate. Some of them say, look, I can provide some resources if you can provide me some additional resources. And we've kind of thinking about and hearing about a kind of give to get approach where some of the service providers provide some of their slots, but they get an equal number of slots or fewer or more slots in exchange. Because at the end of the day, remember the high priority of scoring when you're leveraging funds. If you want to convince the Department of Corrections that they should fund you to the highest amount that you request, then you can make that decision easier for them by saying, for every dollar we ask for you, we're bringing $1 or 50 cents to the table in in-kind services. So that's why you want to really look at your assets and how they can be applied. You want to attack the barriers through your implementation in the first year, particularly in the first couple of months when you've got the ability, as the RFP indicates, to do a short planning stage. So when you probably want to address some of those barriers once you know what they funded. And remember, when we send in this application, we only know what we propose. We don't know what they're going to fund. And when they come back, they're very likely to say funding is less than what you asked for. They might say they want to fund different pieces and not other pieces. Maybe they've made some determinations of some services they can have provided statewide from other departments. We don't know. So know that once the grant is approved, you then have an opportunity to recalibrate your proposal and turn it towards implementation. And then at that time, you would negotiate your timeline and your service implementation plan. I'm going to go to the next area for a minute. Anything that I've said so far, we're going to open the mics and the phone, open the room here. If there's anything to review what I've said so far about priority services, assessment of assets, barriers and gaps, etc., particularly as it pertains to the RFP and determining, as you are all doing now, who are going to help you provide services for these people and who you need to help fund. Questions, comments? Okay, excellent. Now we move into the next area that we talked about, the articulation of target populations and numbers. And you know here that the RFP is clear. You've got to meet one of these goals. Obviously we are. We want to reduce returns to prison. We want to improve community coordination. These words, exactly as they're shown in the RFP, exactly as they're shown here, should find their way in your application at every chance and every opportunity to make sure that the reader and the reviewer understands that you are hitting very discreetly, very specifically, these goals and objectives. In order for the parishes to be clear about how we target and who we target and what the numbers are, we've been working with the Louisiana Public Health Institute, LPHI, for the past year through some gracious funding from the Wilson Foundation to create different types of pipeline data. That is, who's out there? Who's in prison from our parishes? What do they look like by way of risk and need? Pipeline 1. Pipeline 2. So how many people do we think are coming back over the course of, let's say, a given year? In this case, likely latter 2018, 2019, or perhaps by the time all these proposals have been reviewed and all the contracts have to be cut and given the state a break to know that this is the first time they've ever done that. And if they need more time, we need to be patient. And it may be a little bit later in the year that contracts are cut, and then you are going to be entering in, prior to the contracts being cut, contract negotiations, because we don't know yet what, for example, the performance expectations are or the funding. And so your proposals will have to be rethought based on the realities of what we learn. But back to this pipeline data, we've been able to provide you detailed information that gives you a very good idea of what the risk levels and the needs are of these people for each of the 13 tier 1 and 2 tier parishes. And even now, we know that we have to anticipate the answer to the question, which is pipeline 3. How will we know who specifically is returning and when? And when are we going to be introduced to them? And have they signed up for LA-PRI? And what exactly does that mean? Are they clear? Are they moderate to high risk? Have they been told very specifically what is expected of them so that when they're moved to, as we expect, a reentry center within driving distance of the parish, and we go visit them for the first time, they've already been briefed, they're already lined up. All that has to be determined by the Department of Corrections, has to be developed, has to be procedured, and we have to have confidence from them that they're ready to do that. We're not the only ones that need time to decide how to implement, so do they. So we need to be patient and make certain that we take advantage of our timelines. Pipeline 2 is the particular information that's important for the RFP and for the comprehensive plan. It includes state prisoners convicted in LA-PRI Tier 1 and Tier 2. That gives us the first glimpse, and we are recommending, and folks are responding well with the department's blessings, that we use these as a release for proxy for projections in 2018, 2019. Are they exactly right? No. Are they close enough? Yes. We're proposing, and we've got to have a starting point. So as you know, if you've attended the earlier presentation, we're relying on the implementation of the Tiger. And based on conversations as recently as today in the Department of Corrections, it appears that the Tiger will be ready for implementation in September. And September is the earliest possible time that this work could begin. My personal belief, not any formal, position of LA-PRISTA or anyone else, is that I think that it's probably more likely that actually working with clients won't begin until later in the fall. And frankly, we should be open to the idea that it doesn't happen until early in the fiscal year. It all depends on what happens with the number of proposals, how well they're written, how the money can be divided up given the small amount of money. Frankly, $2.6 million, it's nothing to sneeze at. But remember, that money is not just for reentry. That money is for pretrial diversion, court programs, jail programs, district attorney programs, and there's a lot of competition for the dollars. And so the department has a lot of work to do to try to figure things out. By the time we get to implementation, we will be able to rely on the tiger. I'm absolutely sure of it. A lot of faith in LSU, a lot of faith in the department to bring this together. They're doing trainings today at the Department of Corrections. And so I mention all this because the addendum to the RFP came out and it's confused a few folks because it says the department plans on having the tiger ready, but a proposer needs to have an alternative plan to do assessments. I don't exactly know why they said that, because I cannot imagine how a parish would suddenly get access to another validated risk needs assessment instrument. They're not free and they're not quick. And if we start to move in a direction to use the Compass or the Ohio, the ORAS, or the LSIR, this stuff takes weeks and months to develop. Our recommendation at LA-PRISTA is that you focus on the use of the tiger, you document that, and perhaps if you want to address this issue in the addendum, you can say that if the tiger's not available, you'll work with the department to figure out what else you're going to do. But we've had some concern communicated. Does that mean they're walking away from the tiger? I already know it's not going to be available. None of that's happening. The tiger, like any good risk tool, is going to tell you what are the risk levels and what are the need levels. The risk levels, as I've indicated already, in the RFP originally included low risk, high need. That's been cleared up. Low risk persons are not eligible as the highest priority for this RFP. It is in fact moderate to high. What we've suggested at LA-PRISTA as an evidence-based practice, you include those moderate to high risk, but considering the highest risk, highest need, that perhaps you consider those on a case-by-case basis because the highest risk, the highest need prisoners include sociopaths, psychopaths, and career criminals. We certainly do not want to necessarily completely open the door for them, so we have suggested that be done by case, and we have used this information then to help you begin to look at the numbers of people who would otherwise be eligible because of their risk level and their need level. And again, using both information from the tiger and the old risk, we have been able to give you these projections. This is a snapshot. You all have the pipeline 2. It's been delivered to you a couple of different times. It's accessible. That's a social works website that will remind you at the end of this what that website is. But this is just a portion of what that information shows. And it shows that we have this number of people in the target population. I think that the moderate risk, low need is actually included. Let's see. Moderate risk, moderate need. No, moderate risk, low need is not included. They can be, but it makes more sense that since the moderate risk are on the low end, if they have low need, you're not going to get the best bang for the buck. So we've looked at 5 different types of people here. In East Baton Rouge, when you total that up, that's 707 people. When you look at the 707 people and you apply the baseline recidivism rate for the high and the medium risk prisoners at 55%, you see here 389 people are expected to recidivate. That's our target population. But to get there, we obviously have to work with some number higher than this and up to that. Are we going to work? Is East Baton Rouge, for example, going to target 707 people for $500,000? No. It's one of the reasons that when we look at target populations, you start with the big number, which is the total here, and then you interact with that number in your budget and what you realistically can provide by way of case management and service delivery. The numbers that we're starting to hear from parish to parish with the parishes that are speaking to us about it is in the 150 range, maybe ranging in early discussions from 100 to 200. We provided some logic to thinking that 150 might be reasonable, given that there's a limit to how far your budget's going to be able to go. And remember, this is a proposal. If you ask for 500,000 and they fund 300,000, then obviously everything changes. Your milieu of service delivery, what you're paying people, how many people you're targeting, et cetera, that changes it. And then when the department announces their so far undiscussed performance evaluation standards, that changes things too. And we may have to relook at the budgets as a result. But when you're looking and talking with your service providers about what slots they're willing to provide, how much money it's going to cost to pay for the slots, this stuff is not cheap. You're interactive then with that number that I just showed you. In the case of East Baton Rouge, 707, trying to get at a 55% of them that are likely to return in 3 to 5 years. And this is on the comprehensive community reentry plan, and this is where you put those numbers. And this ends up with your client cost. Remember the point made earlier, I'll make it again and again, is that this is the first time that this work has taken place, the first time that the funding's taken place. The RFP recognizes that it isn't a matter of giving you the money and you're going to start working with people right away. You've got in the RFP a relatively open-ended suggestion on a planning phase. Federal grants require at least a 3-month planning phase, sometimes 6 months. I wouldn't recommend 6 months. I think you got to get to service delivery sooner, but certainly 2 or 3 months is workable. So that is all got to be considered when you start to target the number of people you work with. And when I have spoken, as I've been asked to, about how this target population would work if there's 150 people, I suggest that you start slow and you move up the hill. Perhaps start with the first cohort small of 20 people, which, as you know, the department has long supported, beginning with a small cohort. We had expected to have tested out these cohorts by now, but we've been unable to do that. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's a big agency with a lot of moving parts, and we're going to deal with testing and working this thing out and kicking the tires, not through a pilot as we had planned, but through this grants. We suggested for first cohort be that 20, and that we spend 2 or 3 months getting clear how the proposal changes as a result of the funding level and the performance recommendation. You have to mute your phone, please. We're going to get a handle on that, handle on how much money is granted, and then we're going to recalibrate. And then we want to make sure that before we start anything, we're absolutely clear of what the Department of Corrections is going to do and when. When will they be finding the moderate to high risk? When will they be moving them to the center that's within an hour drive of your home? When will they be able to provide us the information on the reentry accountability plan document? Until we know that with confirmation, we can't talk about when we're going to start, because we are not the ones in charge of the whole first part of this. That's what that planning period is for. And there is no doubt that our friends in probation and parole who are at the table working with us, I suspect they'll be working with us in the next couple of weeks in some very dynamic ways as we get ready for the proposals. And we know that we'll be working with them after the proposals, both with the local probation parole and with central office, because the RFP will be done, and now we're back to being able to talk with each other again and do some joint planning. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of interaction on making certain that we're clear about what the department is going to do and when, so that we can respond and be ready on our end. And if we start with a cohort of 20, and that's what we do in the first month, is get them in the reentry centers and begin to work with them, and perhaps in 3 months before they're released, we take a snapshot and we say, let's pause. How are we doing? In 2 ways. Are the parishes doing what they're supposed to have been doing and what they promised? To what extent aren't they? Where are the bugs? Where can we improve? And the same is true with the department. Where were the bugs? Where did things fall down? Did we not get the information in time? Did they not get moved when we thought they would? Did they bow out immediately so we ended up with fewer people? These are the things that we can expect. We need to put into our timeline, into our plans. If you agree with this approach, you start with a small cohort, you take a snapshot of it, and then before you begin your second cohort, which we would recommend be larger, perhaps 30 people, you worked out some of the bugs, and the second cohort should be better. And you take another breath, and you take a pause. How did we do? How did they do? How did we do? And then you do it again, perhaps with 40 in the beginning in the 9 month of the grant, whenever that will be. You don't want to use dates in your grant because we don't know when it starts. You want to use a number of months. And then culminating with the largest cohort of about 60 in month 9 through 12. The third cohort would be month 6 through 9. And then by the time we hit the 60, hoping we're doing better, much better than what we did in the first cohort. In the state of Michigan, where I worked for many years, as many of you know, we did 17 different cohorts over the course of 5 years, and every cohort did better than the last one. We became comfortable with increasing the size of the cohorts. Every cohort did better. It took years for us to be able to say that we were comfortable with the way that was going. So let's give everyone a break and a pause and understand that we're going to work with the department jointly and our service providers to make sure that this first year is very successful and highlights good communication, forthright discussions, and honesty about what's working and what's not working. And all of that interplays with this point that we're talking about here thus far, which is target populations. Now that's a mouthful. So let me go back to this slide on the pipeline 2 and open the table and open the phones if there's any questions or comments about the target population, anything I've talked about relative to these cohorts, etc. Questions or comments? I'll ask, is this helpful? Does this make sense? Will anyone respond?
Makes sense, yes.
We have a local community coordinator says yes, it makes sense.
Yeah.
She's very happy.
Yeah, Dennis, this is Michael Williams. I think it's very helpful.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate the hoorah. Anybody else out there? Any comments? So far, so good? I suspect that many of you have seen this already, and this is brush up. So let me move on to the next part of this. Now we look at what we had recommended for the last week of July was focusing on service delivery, case logic, and evaluation. And the italics that you see on the screen here is a cut and paste precisely from the RFP on page 13, the approach to the scope of the work. And as you can see here, that correlates with a section in the case plan, the CCRP on page 7, case management. This is what the RFP requires. What we're recommending is that this is the point where you begin to reference and attach the documentation that documents everyone's commitment to the LA-PRI model. That includes these documents, a case logic model that describes how people move through the system, the collaborative case supervision model that describes the interactive nature of case planning and management with Department of Corrections personnel, and that these two documents are described in a narrative in the approach to the scope of the work, and that those documents are attached. Beginning with the case logic model, we're going to do a little rehash here. We've asked everyone to have these documents in front of them. I hope you do. I'm about to attempt to do something I've never successfully done before, which is to bring this document up on the screen here. And everyone in the room is holding their breath to see if my skill level has improved. What am I doing? Case logic. You should see this case logic model on your screen. Please hold your applause.
Congratulations, Dennis. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Those of you who suffered through the last presentation know that I was pretty agonizing. And now that I got the document, I'm not going to spend all that much time on it. But you remember in the case logic model that this is the description of what's expected in the LA-PRI from the point of incarceration through the point of discharge off supervision. I'm going to first flash across the top and remind you that there's 12 different steps in this. This is the institutional phase. This is what happens long before they get moved. This is the expectation of what goes on when the folks are in prison, and you'll see the use of the tiger, looking at medium to low risk prisoners for special development of programming, etc., and defaulting those that are lower risk into some lower cost programs. This is an expectation. This is not a reality. We're not implementing the model by phase 1 first, phase 2 second, phase 3. We're actually working kind of backwards. Phase 3, phase 2, phase 1. But my point up here is that we're doing what the LA-PRI model is very clear about. You should be clear about. We assess need, or risk, I should say. We assess need and responsivity. We'll develop a reentry plan. We deliver the programs. We measure progress. That's this circular motion here. This is while they're in prison. We have a programming plan. It's implemented. We see how they do. They can go back and start over. They can do well. We're constantly looking at setbacks, improvements, etc. That's phase 1. When you move into phase 2, we have the next 4 steps. Now we're getting ready for them to be released. Now they've been moved to the local reentry center. Secretary LeBlanc testified to the legislature earlier this week, very clearly his commitment and the department's commitment to moving these men, starting with the men, closer to their home. And he went further than what he's ever went before to talk about the LA-PRI model on this point. He would like to see these men move there much sooner than 3 months, and he plans on working with some of the sheriffs in the state to give them additional funding to be able to begin operating more like a prison would be expected to, and move that time period of pre-release, working within a drive of their home, beyond just 3 months and maybe as much as a year. That's going to take a while. He's been very clear about this is his commitment to work on this. This is a very smart, evidence-based practice. This is what the department says they want to be doing during this phase. This is what you need to feed back to them that you expect them to do, so that as it addresses your functioning, you're ready to do what you are expected to do. That begins here, because as the department is looking at their reentry risk, looking at their needs again, because now they moved from the setting they were. Perhaps they did not have a risk need assessment. Now they're getting one. Perhaps it was old and now they need a new one. And at this point, we're looking at the department, if they're looking at conditions of release, whether it's through the parole process or through community supervision conditions, those conditions and those expectations must be communicated to us in their reentry plan, part 2, so that we know what the department and the releasing authority is saying. That's why this idea of pipeline 3 that I mentioned earlier is important, because if we don't know the specifications of the individual, we can't work with them very well. And so we've got to get this worked out. It's going to take some time, but they're committed to this. And this is, as you know, the place here where we begin the development of the reentry case plan, the supervision, the reentry accountability plan, part 3. This is where the difference in the model really takes hold. This is the first link to the service providers. This is one of the big reasons that we will be more successful in the future than we've been in the past, because prior to release, we're getting people lined up for services. We understand what they need. We can perhaps enroll them and have them ready for day one release to get the services, or pre-enrolled, so they don't have to get on a 6 to 8 week waiting list. This is one of the biggest parts of the model that you need to be able to express in your application. It's what you subscribe to. You understand it's what the department subscribed to. And if all that works, we're ready to rock and roll and start to do this work. To the extent that this is delayed or it doesn't happen, our work will be hindered. You can be clear about that. That's part 2, phase 2. Phase 3 then, as you know, this is the end of it, 3 phases. Now they're released. We finish that reentry accountability plan. If they were pre-enrolled, quasi-enrolled, almost enrolled, we get them enrolled. Now they're in front of their community supervision officer. Now we're moving from conditions of release to scheduling. We need to know what that is. That has to be recorded in the part 3 reentry plan, so that we're not stepping on expectations relative to reporting. At this point in time, the interaction between the community, the reentry center. If you'll mute your phones, please, that'd be helpful. We're getting some feedback here. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Hello?
Whoever just joined us, will you please mute your phone, please? Mute your mic. Thank you. This is the point where we're really going to start making a difference by working jointly with the prisoner's family, people who are working at the release center, and folks in the community and parole. We have to have a reentry accountability plan document that everyone is working with, everyone has access to it, and we got to have a place we can go to and look at it. We don't want it emailed to us. We don't want a paper copy. We want access to a protected site. That has to be worked out. Again, importance for the planning stage. I looked at the upcoming agenda from the implementation steering team meeting that's scheduled for August 22nd. That's the 17th. This is next week. 22nd, the review of the reentry accountability plan is on the agenda. We're looking forward to that. I've been seeing different versions and different copies of it. I think they're ready. Apparently they are. And we'll learn about that. Well, that's got to be the way that we roll. We can't have everybody doing different approaches, because then we'll have no ability to be able to understand cross-system performance. And it's through this then, this is the place where all that stuff happens. You provide the supervision and the services, and if everything goes well, they're going here and they're going to get discharged. And there's a discharge report. But sometimes there's technical violations. Sometimes there's new felony arrests. Sometimes there's new conviction. When there's a new conviction, there can be a revocation. If there's a revocation, they close the summary, and this arrow goes all the way back to the beginning. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You're back. You're starting over. Let's pick up where you left off with your reentry accountability plan, right? That would be the idea. If they get a violation, they don't all go back to prison. Some of them do. Some of them have several violations before they go back. That's all this crazy stuff here that looks complicated. But when you follow the arrow, you have an arrest, you have a technical violation, they can go back up and they can continue to provide services. Here's the thing about these people we're working with. They're not moderate high risk for nothing. They're moderate high risk because they violate and they're non-compliant. The truism of working with people that violate is this: violators violate. They're drug addicted.
But Dennis, how do you classify what is high risk and what is moderate risk?
That is classified by the Tiger, that looks at their history of violations and revocations and compliant and non-compliant, and sorts them according to how they compare to 17 other thousand prisoners. That is done by the Tiger, and we're given that information. We need to be adept at understanding.
My concern about that is those that's coming out of DOC facilities is all moderate risk. Those that's coming out of parish jails and detention centers is high, medium to high risk because they're not being touched by a program.
Well, actually, Renard, let me interrupt. That's not what the data shows us. When you look at the data that we have, that the pipeline 2, you will see, in fact, that upwards of 30 to 40% of the people that are in prison are low risk. I'm not surprised by that. It's one of the reasons Louisiana's prison population is sky high, because you have a lot of low risk people in prison. So it's not the case that they're all high, moderate or high risk. They're not. They may have higher needs if they're working out of the parish jails, because those needs have not been addressed when they're in the parish, but that hasn't necessarily changed their risk level. We've got to be trusting and aware that the science that goes into the Tiger is very, very good science. This is good. This is validated information. And if we don't believe it, then we don't
trust. I do not trust, and I'm going to say it again. I done said it before. I can't trust something I can't see. And I can't trust that the information that you're putting in is the same information accurate coming out. You can't make me understand that, because here's my problem with it. Listen to me. I'm listening, and I'm going to shut up and listen afterwards. What I'm saying, Dennis, is how I know Renard Thomas come out of DOC, he's a high risk, because the Tiger said so. But the Tiger have not sat face to face with one of these guys or one of these women and understood what their problem is. What caused them to be a high risk or low risk or medium risk? Yeah. That's my concern.
Okay, so you're making a very, very valid point, Renard. I want to address it. First of all, the Tiger is not the absolute determination of risk level. It is an input that the folks that determine the risk level use. It's a major input because it's got over 20 factors, historical factors, that the science is showing do have an impact on risk levels. They have to take it into account. Every risk needs assessment instrument in the country, including the Tiger, has the capability for what's called an override. And that override happens when the prisoner is sitting across from the person that's doing the scoring, and for whatever reason, it looks like that risk assessment instrument may be scoring either too high or too low, and they can have an override. I will take you back to the case logic model and show you how this is actually built into it. Right here, there is an override, and what it indicates in this case logic model, there is a tolerance or an acceptability of about a 15% override. If someone, for example, has special needs, they can have an override. Even though they're low risk on the score, if they have special needs, perhaps a sex offender who has no place to live, he's been out of prison 3 or 4 times, he's got no home plan, he doesn't stay out for more than a month, he's back in, he's only committed a couple of crimes and they weren't all that serious, so he's kind of low risk, but they're going to override so that he gets a higher risk level. The same can be true going the other way, that they're scored too high. And someone who's been in prison a long time, perhaps been a trustee for a while, but they're in for a multiple series of, violent crimes perhaps. But here they are now, they're in their 50s, they're doing well, they haven't had any tickets for a long time, they're still coming up high because of the number of failures they had when they were young. They can override. The point that you make, Renard, about you can't trust what you don't know, I want to tell you thank you for raising the point. This is why we have promoted that the communities are fully trained on the use of the Tiger so that they can see what this machinery looks like and understand it well enough to believe it. And so we hope that that happens. So I'm hoping that that helps address some of your issues, and I'm really quite glad that you spoke up and raised them because it gave me an opportunity to talk about something that has come up several times before. So I'm just going to ask Renard if that makes good sense and we can move on.
I'm listening. I don't trust it. It don't make sense to me, and I'm not 100% behind it right now.
Okay, well, let's give it some time, and let's see if there becomes the opportunity that LA-PRISTA has recommended for us to be trained on the use of the Tiger, and let's look at what the Tiger score of the people who are coming out, and let's look at the rate of the overrides, and let's see the degree to which we agree with it, and let's make it experiential and not go by faith alone, but let's work with the folks and let's see if we can get that to work. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Okay, okay, that's good. I was gonna answer for you. I was afraid you'd say no. But anyway, so looking at the case logic model here, at some point they are discharged and there's a discharge report. We expect at some point in the future that the final reentry plan will be done. We have not gotten to that point yet. But here's a point that I'm going to come back to later, so I want to emphasize it. The last column of the case logic model is the outcomes column, and this ties back to all the documentation the Department of Corrections says blessed in the overarching policy and in the system blueprint, a couple of other documents that we have in our portfolio of what the LA-PRI model expresses. So I'm going to pause this for a second. I'm going to go back to my screen here, which I'm going to do in rapid order. You're pretty good at that. And that's the case logic model. Any further questions or comments about this? And thanks again, Renard, for raising that issue. Others? Hearing none, I'll move on. What did I do? What happened? There we go. This is another document that's part of the overarching policy, the collaborative case supervision and management model. Some of the folks on the PowerPoint here today, on the presentation today, have seen more training on this. This is not an area where we've done a lot of training, internal or external to the department, and it's what we were going to try to test out in the pilots, and we did not have the opportunity to do. And the good news is we've got the opportunity to test that now, and the recommendation is to test that out with the first 20 people. We know that the Department of Corrections on probation and parole is agreeing to this, wants this to happen, understands it in a general term, and what we have to do is figure out how it's going to work on the ground. It's a 6-step process of working with clients. Remember, the scoring you get on your RFP gives you a premium for relating the work that you're doing to evidence-based practices. Collaborative case supervision and management is an evidence-based practice. I'm going to take you to that document, which I hope you have in front of you. And this is another area where it's recommended that you feed it back to them, that you say you will adhere to it, that you understand the department will adhere to it, and to the extent that that happens, you will be more successful. And make it clear that you expect there to be some opportunity before you implement services that you have the time necessary to make sure that collaborative case supervision and management model, the CCSM, is owned, operated, and robustly ready to implement by Department of Corrections, probation, and parole staff. To the extent that it is, you can rock and roll. To the extent that it isn't, it's going to be tougher. Don't think it's going to work perfectly well in the first cohort. Think it'll work somewhat. Second cohort better, third cohort better, fourth cohort best. This is a lot of learning for everybody to have. There hasn't been a lot of training on it. There's been very little training. That has to take place. We'll learn more about what the department's plans are for training once the RFP is done. I'm going to attempt to look at this document, so bear with me. In the, sorry. In this document that you should have in front of you, this is the CCM model. It defines it, and it gives you the critical elements. This stuff should all be very familiar to you. This is why everybody agrees to this. This is evidence-based. It makes good sense. This is how we reduce recidivism one client at a time.
Dennis, you keep saying everybody agreed to this, and we in New Orleans, we use what we know works for that November 1st release, and we didn't run into roadblocks. But you telling me what everybody agreed. I need you to define who is everybody.
Well,
I'm traveling the state just like you traveling the state, and you saying everybody, but I'm hearing a lot of folks saying other things. So I need you to be very clear when you say everybody.
So let me be very clear. This document was vetted in the Department of Corrections, and it is addended to and part of the Department of Corrections overarching LA-PRI policy. And so that is part of the they, that is the department. The other part of the they are the parishes that have agreed through the Memorandum of Understanding with the Department of Corrections to implement the LA-PRI, including this. Please make a distinction between what we've agreed to seek and work toward implementing and having it all figured out and ready to rock with it. As I mentioned earlier, this is a commitment to move toward an evidence-based practice. There has not been a lot of training on it. There needs to be a lot of activity here. But I will tell you this, Renard, I know you well enough, and I know people in the state I travel to, and I'm sure the conversations you have are quite a bit different than the ones I have. But I will tell you that when you look at what this collaborative case management outlines in these first several elements here, you'll see why people are agreeable to it. We're trying to change behavior. Interventions are individualized and comprehensive. Returning prisoners are partners in the process, and the teams are responsible to make sure that it all works and we can address their needs. And we're trying to move toward transition seamlessness. The question that I would have for anybody who doesn't support this as a goal as to where we go, what part of this don't you agree with? I've never heard anybody disagree with these particular elements of it. The challenge we have is how are we going to implement it in a way that everybody is on the same page? We need training, we need procedures, we need standards, we need a lot of stuff. We're not going to get that right away. We've got to be able to commit to working together for commonality and common goals. And this is one of the areas where we need a lot more work. And so is that helpful? Moving on, when you look at the details here, and this is part of this, you want to communicate your support for this, this is a good place to do it. It certainly would be good for the department to hear you're committed to the approach that they hope to be able to seek, and it walks through each of the steps. On risk assessment, and shows you in the left column the specific evidence-based research that you can point to that will help you score high on your adherence to evidence-based practices, which this is. By referring and appending this document to your application, you've documented its evidence-based nature. Won't take a lot of time on it, but it starts with risk. It looks like working with these local teams to make certain that people are getting into those institutions, developing the reentry accountability plans. It's being done collaboratively. You're developing them. You're implementing the reentry accountability plan. It describes that. You're going to facilitate access to programs. You're going to involve the offenders in the process. You're going to review progress intermittently. And I will tell you this, that this is a very high level, sophisticated set of expectations that is going to take years to be able to improve and implement well. What we want to do in the first year is work toward it, test it out, work out the bugs with the first cohort, do better with the second cohort, better with the third cohort, better with the fourth cohort, better in the second year. Those of you that have attended the training that we've been doing, you've heard it said many, many times, it's going to take 2 or 3 years to work on all cylinders. Renard, your statement about it ain't the way it happens now and we're running into roadblocks, of course.
No, I didn't say we're running into roadblocks. I did not say that. Because in Orleans Parish, we have those plans. We do not run into roadblocks because we're there for each other. And as the organizations working together, we have not failed one guy, not one guy coming out of the Department of Corrections, not one guy coming out of the parish jail. We have not turned down or turned away. So don't make that statement that we have failed. We have not failed anyone.
You didn't hear any words come out of my mouth that I suggested you failed, Renard. I'm very clear of the successes in your parish, and you're to be congratulated. All I'm suggesting here is that if the Department of Corrections buys into this as much as you have, then things will improve. They will be better. We're here to make your life easier, Renard.
I'm listening to what you're selling. I haven't bought into what you're selling. I'm listening.
Well, good. Let's be mindful. We got a lot of people on the call here, and let's move on a little bit. Thank you. Okay, so next we look at performance measures. This is the italics, is the words verbatim from the RFP. You have to have a logic model about how your objectives are met, milestones, metrics that you propose. Please put your phone on mute. I'll be asking for questions in a moment. What data you propose to use, and you know that, of course, we're focusing on behavior change on the behalf of the people that we're working with. In these documents that we've been sharing with you, the ones I've showed you so far and others I can show you, the system blueprint that you've seen, the overarching policy that is the biggest, most important document because it references these things, the case logic model. There are certain expectations of performance, both for process and impact, that are already written in and agreed to by the Department of Corrections and by those of you that have signed your MOUs, and that includes now all of the top 5 parishes and another 5. You have agreed to work on these things, and I will show you what they are. The ones that are highlighted in red are the ones that are the responsibility of the Department of Corrections, and the ones that are highlighted in red or in black are the ones that are more or less the responsibility of the community. These are process incomes, things that happen, things that can be counted. Risk needs are completed. Evidence-based practices drive supervision. Inmate readiness for release is defined by having a reentry plan. We're addressing risk and needs once they're in the community. We're considering victim impact. This is all written, bona fide, supported, agreed to by the department. We recommend you feed these back to them. Also, impacts. We're reducing harm to communities, increasing restitution. We hope to see some piloting of victim offender reconciliation. In the departments then, we expect them to track convictions, recidivism and returns to prison, and revocations, which we expect to decrease. We expect offenders to receive more services. That's on the community. We expect technical violations to decrease as a result of improved service delivery and compliance. This is what's already been agreed to in these documents. And they are also written into the overarching Department of Corrections LA-PRI plan. This is what is taken directly from that document. You should have it in front of you. I'm not going to go to the document here. We're running a little bit late. But this, again, is the stuff that they've already committed to. And you can see there the ones in black are the ones that are more or less in the responsibility of the community. and you can see the ones in red are more or less responsibility of the department. Now, moving ahead a little bit, because the RFP is silent and did not include these as expectations for reasons that I don't understand. I've expressed my lack of understanding about that, but it is what it is. We're recommending that you feed back to the agency what they've already documented as their expectation in the general sense of the ones that I just showed you, but also to greater detail that we provided you in a document called Recidivism Reduction Performance Measurement Recommendations. And what we're suggesting here, and I am going to flash on that document, that this is stuff that you can send them that says to them, look, this is some ideas that LA-PRISTA has had with a lot of dialogue with the department over the course of the past year. And these are some things that we're willing to do if they're willing to do it. We don't know what your performance plan will be, but here's some ideas to the degree that the parishes can be consistent with this. It will be easier for us to be able to figure out exactly what that performance measurement approach is going to be, which we will not learn until after these proposals have been reviewed and accepted. And so we're at a bit of a disadvantage here. We're trying to make everyone aware of the same information that we've had, and so we've provided this document to you. You excuse me while I find it. This is what that document looks like. You should have it in front of you. It's on the screen. You'll note that it's recommendations. The department has to indicate post RFP what they're willing to do. It's very likely perhaps to look like this. For all I know, it won't. It's not up to me. It's not up to us. But the more of us who say, this is what you've documented, this is what we expect, we hope you adhere to it, the better. This is a recitation of what you've already seen with a little bit more information in it, because it starts to say how this stuff will be counted. So you see in the italics there a little bit more detail. And then more easier to follow perhaps is on the next two tables, where we look at those process measures and we break it down into specific data elements, and we indicate whether the data elements are there or not. And we indicate here in highlighted yellow what we think would be the responsibility of the community if the Department of Corrections ends up doing this. And if they do, then how are we going to make it happen? Who's going to do the work? We've had good positive discussions with the Louisiana Public Health Institute, LPHI. They're willing to do this if the department wants to work with them. They're willing to work with the parishes, but will this happen? We do not know. We're only proposing. This is a solid evidence-based plan. There's been a lot of input from this early on from folks in the department, from their research side, from their operations side. That's been reviewed by some of the best researchers in the country that think it's solid, but it's an outline. There's not a lot of detail yet besides this, but it's a lot more than the blank page that the RFP gives us. We're recommending that you provide this and that it's supported. And that's pretty much all I can really say about it. You can see here in the process measures that there's places here where we've indicated that we think this is more or less in the community side, to make sure we're clear what happens with the training, including training in the community. Gets back to what I said in response to a couple of questions and comments about the reentry plan document, having to be trained on that, the Tiger to be trained on that. Understand what's expected in the collaborative case management, all that stuff. If that's what they want to do, we have to have training. We can count the training. That's why it's a process measure. Are folks getting their reaps before release? They either do or they don't. It's a count. The department will be tracking that, we recommend. And we want to make sure that we've got good reentry accountability plans that are responsive to their risk and need. The only way to do that is to read the reentry plans and get a sample of it, and then report on whether it's got high or low or moderate fidelity. The fact that it says it here, the data is not available. We've got some data sources. The details of this would all have to be worked out. This is a very high-level outline. We're going to look forward to what that performance and evaluation plan the department wants to implement actually is. I hope, and I've recommended to the department many, many times, that it be this, because we put a lot of time into it, but we'll see. When you get into impact measures, it's similar. It's about making certain that services, that folks are enrolled and they're getting services. A lot of this is on the community. If there's a risk need assessment that says certain things have to happen, is it actually being delivered? That has to be determined through performance. This is a lot of work. There's a couple that we think the department ought to handle, and looking at violations and looking at restitution payments. And then the department is planning, we know, some type of longer term evaluation. We're waiting with anticipation for the details of that. What's the design? How will it work? When will it be implemented? This is high level stuff. I'm going to leave this up and I'm going to open it up for questions and comments about this. It's up to you, to the degree to which you use any of this, or the degree that you use only the higher level stuff that you've seen in these other documents that are laid out here, or just use the even less specific stuff that's in the documents that I showed you. It's up to you, or whether you want to come up with a bunch of your own. It's totally up to you. All we're suggesting is this is good stuff. Consider using it. And to tell you that the more people that are clear about it, the better position all the parishes will be in. So let me open up the phones and comments from anyone if you want to unmute or in the room. We'll give you a minute to unmute. I'll ask you again whether this makes sense to you and see if anyone's willing to comment.
May I go back to an earlier slide?
You may do whatever you like.
You don't need to go back to the slide itself, but to quote the allocation of funds for no more than 6 months from release with services and no more than 20% pre-release.
Yeah.
Specifically, what do they mean by 20% pre-release? 20% of the funds?
Well, I can't speak to the RP. So the question is, and let me indicate that if we are in fact, let me just slide it up here. If we are in fact going to implement stuff that can be counted, we're dedicating to what we have long understood to be a minimum of 3 months prior to release and any length of time post-release. In the addendum to the RFP, I only know what I read, that you can read as well. And it says, there was a question put about, that maybe that's not so evidence-based. I mean, what if these guys need more? My personal experience and my review of the literature is they definitely going to need more. You have an escalating number of people that are failing on community supervision post-release. They don't all fail within the first 6 months. It's important to front load. That is evidence-based, but you don't stop services after that. This is a particular part of the RFP that I can't personally support as a dedicated person at evidence-based practices. The good news, the addendum said, if you want to make the case on why that should be longer, do so. I suggest that you do so. I don't understand the 20% restriction, except perhaps they were wanting to make sure that you weren't doing reentry programs that put all of the stuff pre-release, but the 20% figure isn't a magic number, neither is 3 months. The fact is that programs across the country that have spent upwards of a year pre-release do a whole lot better. That's why when Secretary LeBlanc talks the other day and in even more recent conversations said that his goal would be to have that pre-release extended, that's evidence-based. What are we starting with here in terms of that ratio? I think that you've got to figure out how you want to say that in your RFP and suggest that what you know from the documentation that you've had is that it's a 3 month pre-release. And if that's 20%, then post-release is going to be more than 6 months. This is what the research says. It's 30%, 70%. So I don't know how they came up with 20. I think they just made it shorter. But the research generally says that if you're doing a milieu of a treatment and programming pre-release and post-release, that generally speaking, you got to have a whole lot more post-release. And they have recommended in general sense 30%, 70%. I think this is a place where you can say what the science says, you can talk about what the documentation says, and then say, however, if the rules of engagement here and the contract stipulates that you're restricted, then you will comply. You don't want to create an expectation that if it's not exactly the way you say it, my way or the highway, that you're not going to play ball. We don't know where the department's going to go with that. We don't understand it. We can't talk with them much about why it's there. So we just kind of have to roll with it. Is that helpful?
Do you think they mean 20% of the time? Or
Yes.
20% of the dollars?
I think they mean 20% of the time, but I don't know. I can't speak for them.
So would that
Maybe
Others think dollars.
others think it's 20% of the dollars. But here's the thing is that if it's the dollars, well, that's good news, because I don't think we're going to be expending a lot of service provider money in that 3 months. Most of that work is going to be happening in the release centers by the staff there. What we have to make sure is there's good transition planning. That hasn't been clarified. And I'm not an expert on these addendas. I mean, these are long. I don't think it says anything much more in there. I don't think there's clarification that the 20% means dollars a time. If you want, I suppose, you could always act like it meant dollars, and that way you can act accordingly. I can't make any statements relative to the RFP specifically. I don't have anything to do with it, really. But I think that you say what makes sense, you interpret it the way that makes best sense to you, but you give the caveat, post-award, once we're clear what we have, what the performance expectations are, and what exactly the Department of Corrections expects from us, to what degree the model that we've been learning from is actually going to be followed. What is the department going to do when? Once we're clear about that, then we're ready to have a contract. You've got all sorts of opportunities here, and so that's a big part of it. And then you have the opportunity to say, well, we need to recalibrate. We need a couple of months to make sure that locally we're interactive with all our parole folks, and they are fantastic. Everywhere I've worked, they're on board. I haven't had anything but eagerness. And the new folks they've hired, the program managers, are exceptional, and they will be a big part of this. And frankly, in the work that we've done to date, we've recommended, and it seems to be sticking, that we think that those program managers should be very highly dedicated to the issue of what happens pre-release and how we make sure there's a bridge between what's happening in the center and what's happening in the community. They're liaisons. They should be looking upstream to make sure the Department of Corrections on the prison side and on the parole side, the parole board side, are following the model, are following the policy. And they should look downstream and make sure that the parole staff are doing it. And if they need training, then let's get them training. If there needs to be dialogue, get their dialogue. They are very likely to be the single most important person in the Department of Corrections is doing this work because that's their job. They're not to carry caseloads. When you marry the work that they're to do with the community coordinator, I think you've got a good team. I recommend that that the proposers do not recommend large amounts of money to develop staffing that becomes another layer of administration. It does take the work. The staffing that should take place, to the most part, perhaps, as I'm hearing from a lot of folks, is around improved case management. Case managers who have got competency in alcohol, substance abuse, mental illness, and/or family issues. So you kind of get a twofer or a threefer. Every parish is going to work that out themselves. Every parish has got to interpret this. To some degree, maybe we'll have some consistency from some of the parish. We haven't had 100% participation in the training, 100% adherence to the idea that they're doing a comprehensive plan. Every parish does what they want, and this will be no different. But we're hopeful that this will create some expectation of standardization across parishes for this. Make sense?
I do think that in these areas where there is ambiguity, if we parishes cooperate and present a united front, that we will have more effectiveness in our successful proposals, because we will frankly be deemed as having the rational response. Yes. And what's funny is that in most grant making processes, there's an emphasis on points of distinction between proposals. But in this instance, I believe that we as the community groups have more at stake at presenting consistency.
Yep.
Because that validates the logic and
Yep.
the underlying evidence-based
Yep.
model for our funding.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that any parish, and we've seen evidence of this already, they're starting to share the documentation they have. Those of the parish representatives that have been attending this have been talking to us. There are certain types of preparations that are being made now in terms of allocation. They're sharing their processes. Some parishes share more than others. LA-PRISTA is perfectly suited to be able to help you develop those networks. I think the parishes know each other to a certain extent. There is a bit of a challenge to get all that done in the next week and a half. It's been done to a certain extent. Maybe we'll see some more of that. I strongly suspect that the time when the parishes could come together and think about this and work together is after the applications have been in, particularly before they come back. There's going to be a pause in the action. We're not going to know what they're doing. And it might be a good time for the parishes, if they're willing, to share what are public documents. As soon as it gets put in, it's a public document. To share those documents and think about points of similarity and points of differences and understand each other a little bit. Because when it comes time to negotiate contracts, and if that negotiation includes a grant award, which is less, as I think we should probably plan on, than what you've asked for. We don't know how much all the parishes are asking for. Some are looking at $500,000, some are looking at a lot more. It's kind of up to them. But when we get to the point that we know what the grant awards are and the similarities of those awards across parishes, that creates a perfect opportunity for you all to come together and have a much more powerful voice as a group. If you choose a collective. If you choose to do that through the association that was formed for the steering teams, then we certainly think that's a good idea. But you can do it under whatever form you want. There's no compelling nature of this. But if you work post submission prior to the award to get a group together to share information, I think it would be a remarkable discussion, and you could set aside a day just to share information and interact with each other. We haven't seen a lot of that. Across the board, we've seen different pockets. So I think that's a good point. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to ask folks to open the mic, and let's see if there's any comments and questions about the performance stuff. And Renard, if you could just hold your question for a second, I want to make sure if anybody else has any questions or comments, we give them a chance, because I know you will have something to offer us. But before you do, does anybody have anything to offer or suggest or question on anything that's been said on this issue of performance?
Dennis, it's Jules Edwards. I have a question about the document that you're displaying, and you had some of the material highlighted. What was the significance of the highlighted sections in your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Judge, and glad you're here. I certainly enjoyed our time together in Lafayette earlier this week. Or was it last week? It all blends together. Must have been last week. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that you'll see here are suggested as community responsibilities. These are suggested by DPSC and their research partner. The ones that are highlighted are suggested to be what the communities are going to be responsible for. So that's why you see some are highlighted and some are not, both for process and for impact. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments on this from anyone? Okay, Renard, you got the floor.
Thank you.
Renard?
Dennis, we share information. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, we share information, and Rio sends out a newsletter and posts slides and presentations from all over the state, from all 5 parishes on their website. and they share information every Monday morning. So
That's
if
good.
a coalition or group is organizing a meeting, they normally send their minutes to Real, and Real shares their minutes to whoever want to read them.
That's
So
great. That's
they share
very positive.
information.
Very positive.
Huh?
I said that's very positive. Thank you for sharing and reminding folks of that. I think the point that Todd was making and the point that we're making, that I was making, was once these proposals are put together, that's a lot of detailed information. And while the information can be shared in written form, it might be a great opportunity for folks to come together, to be able to come together. And as I mentioned, you can do that under whatever rubric or framework you want, whether it's Real or whether it's LA-PRISTA, or you can do it on your own. There's a lot of different ways to be able to share information. So thank you for that. I think a lot of folks are aware of that and receiving that that newsletter. Bonnie? Okay, we got a couple of chat comments. Can you read them to me?
Christina asked, do they conduct the Tiger for leaving parish jails?
Well, the plan is for them to do that. We don't know exactly when that will take shape. The larger plan is that they're starting a central reception center for men in a prison, and they're starting to work with clients where all of that risk need assessment will be done at intake. This is one of those areas where we know where they want to go, but we don't know exactly when they're going to get there and how long it's going to take. But the expectation is that, yes, everybody who gets moved to your location near you will have that risk assessment done. If not, then it'll be done at intake. There should not be any circumstance where you were meeting with an individual in this framework at that community center, at that reentry center, who has not had not only a Tiger risk assessment, but you know what that assessment shows, and the client you're working with has already said, yes, I want to participate. All that's supposed to happen in advance. I hope that answers your question, Christine. We have another question?
Michael Williamson just commented that he totally agreed with what Todd was talking about in sharing the information.
Okay, good. Any other comments or questions here while we have the mic open on this? Or I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And this is where I left off. And we are concluded. We've got a lot going on. Folks are working very, very hard. They're trying to make sense of a lot of the stuff that isn't totally clear. You've got to use your own teamwork and collaboration to be able to make sense of it. Everybody's working from a different set of expectations and experiences. Every parish is different. We have a lot of successes over the years. Some of the parishes, like Orleans, for example, they've been doing this work for 6 years. They got a lot of experience under the belt. They've had a lot of good successes. Other parishes have never done it. They're kind of starting from scratch, and so there's a lot of different approaches out there. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. I'm going to leave this slide on there. You see there the LA-PRISTA Social Works website, laprista@socialworks.org. All the documents we showed on the screen here. All but the first presentation was recorded and is there for you to look at your leisure. The guy who was running the first one forgot to press the record button. So let me open it up for any final questions or comments, and we're at our prescribed hour and a half. We had asked you to set aside 2 hours in case there's a lot more questions. I see people are leaving.
We have a question.
We have a question.
From Ramona Harris.
Oh, Bush Harrison.
No.
I got one from her. So what's yours? Go ahead and read. I've one here that says, what are the next steps after today? And the next steps are your end is to write the thing and submit it. If y'all want to share information with each other, you can do it directly. If you want LA-PRISTA to help share that information, you've got our contact information. If you want REAL to help bring that together, you can contact them. You're probably on their list. Those are some next steps. I think what we look forward to at LA-PRISTA is to the degree that you want some interaction now, we'll help with it. There are, perhaps certain parts of the comprehensive plan that we can share with folks if folks are willing to do that, willing to share intermediary agreements if the IO is interested in doing that. We'll do that, but we're probably going to just kind of leave you alone here to get the work done. And then Bonnie will be in contact with you after the RFPs are done, sometime in September after you get a breath and see whether or not anybody would like to organize in that regard. We have another question. What is it?
That's it.
Okay. Anything else? We got a 10-4. Thank you, Ms. Bush Harrison. That's a thumbs up. Any other questions or comments?
And Dennis, real quick, I don't want to put words into my coalition and my steering committee mouth, but we have folks come from St. Tammany, Lafayette, Morgan City, down to New Orleans to our steering committee meeting and our regular meetings for the reentry task force. And we haven't turned any folks away. So if folks want to come when we have training, they're more than welcome to come.
Good, thank you.
I know. Okay?
Appreciate that. I think that's probably true of all of the steering teams that are formed. I certainly know it's true here in East Baton Rouge. But that's good. Thank you for pointing that out. Any other comments or questions before we conclude? There was a question about the slides. Vonnie answered it. They'll be on the website. And so will this recording. Proving, of course, that I know how to move from the PowerPoint to the documents for the first time. Now that we're done, I finally learned how to do it. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments, feel free to write Bonnie. We'll try to get those answers to you. Good luck on your proposal, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.